Good morning, everyone. I'm Paula Dobriansky. I'm a senior fellow here at the Belfer Center in the Future of Diplomacy Project, and we're very delighted to have all of you here this morning. There are those of you who are here with us face-to-face in person, and then we have those who are online. And I'm going to first go immediately to Jack Rader, who's a student here at the Kennedy School and also from the UK, to say a word of greetings to our very distinguished guests this morning. Over to you, Jack.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Good afternoon and welcome to the Future of Diplomacy Project and the Project on Europe and the Transatlantic Relationships event on Europe's security landscape. My name is Jack Rader and I'm an MPP student here at the Harvard Kennedy School. I'm originally from the UK and I'm the co-chair of the Harvard British and Irish Caucus. I'd like to welcome both our in-person and virtual guests. For those of you in the Zoom room, please feel free to raise a virtual hand to ask a question during the Q&A portion. Also be aware that this session is being recorded, that your image may appear in the recording, and that we may post this video to the Belfer Center's website. Whilst this event is on the record, the event prohibits any attendees, including journalists, from audio, visual recording, or distributing parts or all of the event program without prior written authorization. It's my great pleasure to welcome Dame Karen Pierce and General Sir Nick Carter to the Kennedy School today for a conversation about the UK's perspective on security in Europe. Dame Karen Pierce is the incumbent ambassador of the United Kingdom to the United States. Dame Pierce has had a more than 40-year diplomatic career in His Majesty's government. Prior to her current posting in DC, she served as the UK's permanent representative to the United Nations in New York and as Director General for Political Affairs and COO of the Foreign Office. General Sir Nicholas Carter has had a more than 45-year career in British defence that culminated as Chief of the Defence Staff, functioning as the principal military advisor to the Prime Minister. General Sir Carter has commanded military operations in Northern Ireland, Cyprus, Bosnia and Kosovo, Iraq and Afghanistan, and has created a number of military coalitions in the Middle East, Caribbean and Baltics. General Sir Carter is also now a visiting senior fellow at the Belfer Centre. Our conversation today will be moderated by Ambassador Paula Dobriansky, Senior Fellow with the Future of Diplomacy Project and a diplomat with extensive experience in European security. Without further ado, I'll hand back over to the Ambassador to get us underway. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jack. I think I have this on. Yes, I do. Just want to make sure. Thank you so much for the introduction and for the greeting. I would like to begin before I make a formal introduction, if I may, to ask General Sir Nick Carter to say just a few words of remembrance, as well as Ambassador Dame Karen Pierce, of our dear colleague, friend, a leader here at the Kennedy School, the Belfer Center, Ash Carter. If I may, General Carter, if you don't mind saying a few words, and then Ambassador.
No, thanks, Ambassador. Of course, the impetus behind this event, as I suspect many other events at this great institution, was, of course, Secretary Carter and his contribution to his country, but also to his allies, like me, has been absolutely immense, I think, and it spanned a huge number of generations. I didn't know him as well as people in this room would have known him, but the first time I met him, he was responsible for procurement, and I was commanding a lot of American troops in southern Afghanistan and US Marines. And he arrived in his procurement capacity from the Pentagon, and I was hugely impressed by his dedication and his absolute determination to save lives as quickly as he possibly could. Now, I don't think that's appeared in any of his obituaries, but the plain fact is that he was responsible for saving a significant number of lives through what he did in terms of procuring the right equipment that was necessary and genuinely understanding what the need and the requirement was. Of course, he was a scientist, but he was also a PhD in modern history. He was an immensely generous human being, as I certainly found personally, and he had capacity like nobody that I've ever really come across before in terms of his intellect and his ability to get stuff done and to do it. He'll be huge boots to fill, and we'll all miss him hugely. So that would be my thoughts on a wonderful man. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador.
Well, I didn't know him personally, but he has been a presence throughout all my postings in America. When I first arrived, Bill Clinton was elected and Ash Carter had, I think, the undersecretary, or at least a prominent position in DoD. And as General Nick said, he went from strength to strength. He had an amazing intellect. He was a huge supporter of the US-UK defence relationship and the special relationship more generally. And he studied at St. John's College in Oxford. And he did great things when he was in charge. He opened up military combat posts to women and trans people. He also did fantastic work with our Defence Secretary on cyber offensive and defensive. So I always think of him as one of those amazing figures pushing the envelope and inspiring the next generation and really defining American defense policy. So my condolences, the embassy's condolences to the Belfer Center and to all of you on his loss. And obviously our sympathies go to his family. He'll be enormously missed.
Thank you both for that, those tributes. It's much appreciated. If we could just take a moment, a brief moment of silence. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to go back to Jack. Jack, thank you for your opening. I did notice that you graduated from Oxford before you got here. I felt I had to point that out because the ambassador is from Cambridge. And Sir Nick, I'm going to say Sir Nick, or General Nick is from the Sandhurst Military Academy. So we might have a little sparring going on here this morning. I also was very struck by a few details about them that I wanted to add to the wonderful introduction and opening that you gave. One is General Carter, you have, as was mentioned, been named a visiting fellow here at the Kennedy School and at the Belfer Center. But also I noticed that you are the longest serving military chief since Lord Mountbatten, having spent nearly 8 years in senior leadership. You're chuckling. That is okay. That's historic, very important. So I do want to say that. And also, Ambassador, I'd like to point out something about her that I find very distinctive. When I first met her, to me, one of the things that really stood out was the fact that you did serve. Well, you've served in a number of very high-level positions before, but I wanted to pick out Afghanistan, where extremely knowledgeable you were, the UK's ambassador to Afghanistan, and it's an area that you were very dedicated to, certainly. I also do want to and so thank you both for your international and global engagement. I also would just like to recognize a few people who are also with us. General Joe Dunford, who's here as a fellow at the Belfer Center, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and also a dear and close friend of Ash Carter's. Also, Eleni Robredo, the former president of the Philippines, and Mary Entima. Where is Mary? There you are. Okay, couldn't see you. Mary, who spearheads the very active World Boston. Glad you could be here also this morning. So let's dive right in. We have a lot to cover, and I'm going to ask some questions, and then we're going to go to all of you. So let me start with this. The UK has really been front and center, as you both know, in terms of, yes, the expression over there of the domestic political turmoil. When we think of Rishi Sunak, the third prime minister in 7 weeks, in his first speech as prime minister of the UK, he warned of a profound economic crisis. He went through all the cost of living issues. He went through the high energy costs because of the war in Ukraine, and very concerned about teetering financial markets. I mean, you know where the UK has been. So my first question to both of you is just stepping back and really looking at where the UK is, where is Britain these days in terms of its global engagement, and because of some of the challenges at home. If I may, shall we go to you first, Ambassador Pierce, and then we'll go to General Nick. I like that, if I may.
Well, I'm the serving official, and Nick is Nick is gamekeeper turned poacher. So you'll get two perspectives. And Nick and I, the first time I met Nick was when he was on the ground in Afghanistan doing some fantastic work for NATO. I mean, fundamentally, you had the Queen's state funeral, which was a week's worth of very historical pageantry, if you like, with a lot of tradition. And then we had 2 prime ministers and 4 chancellors. So Britain went, if you like, from this incredibly stable, historical, massive pageantry to lots of political upheavals very quickly. But I think the first is more indicative of Britain. It is a solid, stable country. It remains a solid, stable country. Those political blips were just blips. And politics is now settling back to what I would call its normal level with an election, general election, I should say, in 2 years. It's a feature of British politics that you can change the Prime Minister without an election. And that's because in British politics, unlike in America or France, the electorate is deemed to vote for a political party. It's not deemed to vote for a Prime Minister, and therefore they can change the leader of the party and hence the Prime Minister, and both Labour and Conservative governments have done that. What Boris Johnson did that was unique, though, was to call a general election immediately after being elected leader, which is where he got his majority from. So there's something interesting about how electorates view these sorts of changes. Nevertheless, we've now settled back into the normal groove. And as Ambassador Paul has said, there are a number of economic challenges for all of us on the horizon. To be honest, it's not unique to Britain. The situation in the rest of Europe is every bit as difficult. It's difficult here, but for slightly different causes. And I think I'm right in saying the inflation and cost of living figures are gradually on a downwards trajectory here, which is not yet true of Europe. But if you look ahead, then growth predictions remain on track. The immediate issue is to get through the winter, to find fuel supplies, security of energy supplies, but also for the British government to find ways of helping ordinary citizens with their fuel bills. And that's a dilemma that many people have, many governments are wrestling with across Europe. The markets are starting to settle down. One can never be too confident, but I think the fact that the Prime Minister is now a former Chancellor is reassuring to the markets. And I think once they start settling and the rhythm of multilateral summits picks up in the autumn, so citizens can see G7, G20 leaders grappling with some of these problems, I think the cost of living crisis will still be a problem, but it won't seem like as much of a crisis. We will get on with dealing it methodically.
What impact, if any, has it had on Britain's global engagement in foreign policy? I mean, you've been very engaged in Ukraine. And then I'll come to you, General Carter.
I honestly don't think it's had any impact on Ukraine. Successive prime ministers from Boris Johnson to Liz Truss to Rishi Sunak rang President Zelensky, the first person Rishi Sunak talked to. The second world leader was President Biden. They had a very warm conversation. Britain will go to all the summits that are coming up. I don't, to be honest, I mean, you'd expect me to say this, but I genuinely think it is true. It does not have an impact. What it does do is make some people think, oh, the Brits can have interesting politics just like everyone else. So we don't want any more of those superior lectures. Thank you very much. That's what I think.
Okay. All right, General Carter, your perspective on this question.
Yes, I mean, I think was it The Economist that coined the phrase "brittly" in describing the UK's position over the last month or so. Well, as I rather agree with Ambassador Pierce, I think we're probably through that, and we've got what hopefully will be a return to boring government, which of course is what we all really want, isn't it? in terms of the actual question, what impact it'll have on our sort of global foreign policy and perhaps our global security policy. I mean, first and foremost, I think, the major impact on all of that happened on the 24th of February this year when Mr. Putin invaded Ukraine. And I think that has given us a laser-like focus on the importance of European security. And there was a lot of discussion, I think, when the UK's integrated review of defence diplomacy, etc., was published last year about whether the UK was all of a sudden going to be focused entirely on the Indo-Pacific. Well, people didn't really read the document carefully enough. The plain fact is that our security starts in Europe and always has done, and I think always will do. So I think it's given us a real laser-like focus on that. In terms of the financial position, I mean, obviously, as a defence aficionado, I'm nervous about what this might all mean to defence expenditure. I mean, Boris Johnson's government was very clear that he wanted the UK to spend 3% of GDP by 2030 on defence. And of course, I think, I would argue that that's the minimum you need to spend on defence. But I do think that Mr. Sunak is going to look at this with a hard-nosed look. I think he probably feels that it'll be difficult to increase defence expenditure at that rate. And how that bears upon the role that the UK plays in NATO will obviously be something that we have to think about. And I think some of the questions that the Ambassador will turn to in a moment will take us in that direction. So I think that there are going to be difficult choices that have to be made, but the emphasis, I think, will be on European security, with obviously an interest in what happens in the Indo-Pacific, because, of course, Britain's prosperity will depend upon what happens in the Asian century.
General Carter, the Financial Times recently cited a speech that you delivered 40 years ago, and in which at that time you had said that Moscow represented, quote, a clear and present danger on Europe's doorstep. And then it went on to say that it could initiate hostilities sooner than we expect. And you went on to advise that it was imperative that Britain should reduce its vulnerabilities, particularly to Russian malign influence, disinformation, and upgrade its armored infantry capabilities. The question here is, how has Russia's aggression in Ukraine reshaped transatlantic security specifically? And what about the future of these European defense agreements? What's the impact here? Let's go with you first on this one.
Yes, I mean, I think people will remember back in 2019, before the last NATO summit, President Macron suggesting that NATO was brain dead. Well, I think we've moved on from there. And I think what Ukraine has probably revealed is the extent to which NATO matters, and indeed the extent to which NATO depends upon a strong US leading NATO, wherever NATO might be employed in the world, and particularly in Europe. So I think that President Macron probably wouldn't say that any longer. I also think it's begged some big questions about President Macron's view on European strategic autonomy, because I think if many things will have come out of the war in Ukraine, but I think an absolute clarity that the US is the big player in NATO and has provided most of the support that Ukraine has received will not be lost on Europeans. And the plain fact is that not many European countries have been able to provide that much to Ukraine. And the reality is, of course, is that their armed forces over the last 20 years have become markedly hollow. And of course, what this suggests, I think, is that countries are going to have to rebuild their defenses and address the hollowness in their defense forces in a way that perhaps might not have been thought important even a couple of years ago. So I think it's been a wake-up call in that way. And I think Germany is the great illustration of this. I think a lot of people sitting perhaps on this side of the Atlantic wondered how Germany made itself so dependent upon Russia. And you have to go back in history. When you think that 28 million Russians died in World War II, yes, the Germans absolutely think about the Holocaust, but they also, I think you'll find, those who lived through that would have a guilty conscience about the 28 million Russians, members of the Soviet Union, who lost their lives. And for that reason, the notion of Ostpolitik has been something that Germany has followed for all of my lifetime, and for longer than that, I guess, as well. And they believed in change through trade. And that was very much the German foreign policy position. So I think it's important to apply history to the reason why we are where we are. But of course, that's all changed. And the speech that the Chancellor, Mr. Schulz, made on the 28th of February, put Germany in a completely different position to where it's ever been before. And I think that will have a marked impact upon how Europeans see it. I think lots of the Eastern Europeans are saying, I told you so. This is something that we've known about all along. And of course, General Dunford and I wrestled with the new NATO military strategy as it was, as a pair of chiefs together back in 2018. And of course, there was this tension between the Westerners in NATO who thought that terrorism was what the problem was all about, and those in the East who thought that Russia was what the problem was all about. I think minds are now much more focused on Russia, perhaps, than they are on terrorism. So I think those are the sort of the main changes that I see. So in a way, I think it's been a wake-up call, but it's also, I think, been a helpful way of focusing minds on what certainly I thought 4 years ago was the predominant threat in existential terms to NATO and to the West and the world that we all want to live in.
Thank you very much, General. Ambassador, maybe the same question, and let me, if I may, just expand it just a little bit. You know, what else should the West be doing to ensure Ukraine's victory? That's a term that has been used by many in Washington, that we do want to see Ukraine's victory. What else should we be doing? And let me toss this out. It's some people, you know, have debated this question, but should Ukraine be ultimately brought into NATO?
Yeah, no, that's a very hard one, and the Ukrainians have sometimes a tendency to expose this debate in public, which is not always the most helpful way forward, I would say, because it gives Putin something to latch onto.
Then you don't have to answer it if you don't.
No, I'm happy to answer it. I just want to pick up on something General Nick said. If you completely agree with your analysis of Germany and its Ostpolitik. If you go back to 2007, Munich Security Conference, Putin laid out with chilling clarity his view of Europe and his view of Ukraine, and lo and behold, it's come good. So there is something about us sharpening our collective government political antennae to listen to what certain actors on the world stage are telling us. And to be prepared for something does not mean it will happen. But I spent a lot of my early career on politico-military issues, and we were always taught to look at capabilities and not at intentions, which I think is a lesson that holds good today. What more should we do for Ukraine? I'm going to start with the economy, because although that's not the most pressing issue, it is the issue that underlines everything that happens in Ukraine and has done since Ukraine became independent. And the Ukrainian economy is not a robust market economy. It's badly in need of quite severe structural reforms and has a lot of corruption and lacks governance. And one of the things we are thinking about, and again, this is not our main task, but it's important, I think, for the future of what Ukraine becomes, is not only how to get structural financial support into Ukraine, and the EU is looking at this, but can it be done in a way that isn't just a war economy? Can it be done in a way that starts not dissimilar to Germany herself immediately after World War II? Can it be done in a way that addresses some of these structural issues? And speaking personally, I really hope we can put energy and attention onto that amidst all the conflict and war issues, because it is probably true that Putin was emboldened to do what he did in Crimea in 2014 because he thought Ukraine wasn't getting her act together in a whole range of areas. I think there is a legitimate question as to what is the pattern of Ukraine's conflict now, the tactics, the strategy. We supply weapons and advice on a reactive basis, if you like. We watch the Russians fire a different weapon system at Ukraine or pick a different set of targets, and then NATO and all the countries in Ramstein, there are about 44 countries helping supply weapons. And as General Nick said, they're not all in Europe. New Zealand sends equipment to Ukraine. It's reactive for obvious reasons. We want to show that this is Ukraine defending herself. It's not Ukraine attacking Russia. I think there will be a pause of some sort over winter. And I think it would be good to use that to evaluate how we go forward. What do the Ukrainians want? by way of asking for a ceasefire? What might they want to accept? All these questions, which typically accompany the kinetic side of a conflict, I think we will need to talk about. But to echo what the administration have been saying recently, this is Ukraine in the lead. This is not a Bosnia type situation where the powers sit back and leisurely go through models for a future country. This is all about what Ukraine wants, and we will continue helping Ukraine for as long as she wishes us to do so.
By the way, before I go back to you, General Carter, just a word I'd like to just say on the issue of NATO enlargement. It's worth stating, actually, Zelensky actually had said that he did not want to go forward with NATO. That was his last statement. But what he resented was the fact that the Russians had demanded that actually they codify in their constitution that they would never, ever join NATO. And the Ukrainians have absolutely, from their own sovereign rights, have opposed that being told that you can't ever join NATO. So I just thought I'd say that they themselves, I think, have made an important statement there. I'm going to ask a few more questions, so get ready with yours, because we're going to go to you. I'm conscious of the time, and we really want to have a robust discussion here. General Carter, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add to that, but if not, let me flip over to another area. And you touched upon it because you delved into Germany. And that is the question about energy security here. You know, thinking about Germany, and as you said, kind of a lesson learned in Ostpolitik, could you say a word just about how this has shifted now? It's not just about actually Germany, but I look at all the initiatives. I mean, yes, Germany's looking to set up an LNG terminal. There's definitely a preparation of moving away from that dependence. How does that fit in the overall military and strategic calculus?
Can I come back to that in a moment? I just want to
Sure.
pick up on your previous question.
Okay,
because
good.
I think that
Good.
I
Thank
think
you.
it's quite important when we talk about a Ukrainian victory to be clear about what victory might mean. And I think there are lots of debates about this. I mean, I suspect that if you're a Ukrainian, you probably sit somewhere between it's got to be the status quo ante the 24th of February this year, and it may well be that you feel that Crimea is part of that equation. Now, I think you also have to take a view, and you know, I would say this as a senior military officer who is always looking for helpful political guidance, that these are important objectives that need to be set. And I think that we have a right, and I'm afraid, disagree slightly with Dame Karen on this, because I think that Ukraine is really only able to achieve whatever objectives Ukraine might want to achieve with our support and our assistance. So I think we do have a dog in the fight when it comes to defining what victory might look like. And I think it's important that we are clear about that, because at the moment I do worry that our approach is very much an approach of crisis management rather than a strategy. And it's good to hear that work is being done to think about how we might rebuild Ukraine in the future, along the lines perhaps of a Marshall Plan. But the reality is, if we don't think this thing through to the finish, there's a serious risk of escalation leading to miscalculation. And I would worry about that as a senior military officer. So I think that being clear about what victory might or might not mean, and what it might mean in relation to a cost to Putin, is something that is pretty fundamental in our analysis. And I'd certainly like to see more done on that. But turning to the point on energy, I mean, I think that Europe will muddle through this winter, assuming it's not a terribly cold winter, and maybe we'll be helped by climate change on this. But at the moment, the stocks and reserves in Europe are reasonably good, and that's because probably 70% of the gas that Europe has in its stocks have come from Russia this year. The real problem is going to be next year, because there will be no gas from Russia. And the answer is that European countries are very much focused on this winter and not on next winter. And that means that supply, I think, will be a challenge. And of course, the problem with gas is that you need infrastructure. You can't just simply create pipelines overnight. Now, you can create some of these mobile maritime platforms that can enable LNG to be imported from Qatar or the United States, wherever else. But the reality is that Europe's infrastructure is geared to receive gas from Russia. It's not geared to receive gas from elsewhere. And that's going to take a while to change. And I think that Europe is going to struggle with an energy crisis, not necessarily this winter, but definitely the winter afterwards, and probably the winter after that one as well. And that is going to lead to blackouts, and it is going to, I suspect, in Mr. Putin's mind, challenge the extent to which our political will and political commitment to the war in Ukraine is going to endure. And I think it's something that leaders in Europe are going to have to step up to the plate and prepare their populations for the sorts of privations that they're likely to have. Now, of course, the other loser in all of this, I'm afraid, will be the climate, because, of course, what we're seeing is that coal has become more important again. And I'm afraid that is going to lead to a degradation in the climate. And it's also going to lead to several steps back in terms of climate change. And I think we're going to have to think quite profoundly about what this means. And we're going to have to think quite profoundly about how we are going to get back onto a plan that genuinely can deliver the sort of targets that we set ourselves in Paris, but also reinforced in Glasgow last year. And I think that will be quite a challenge for all of us. And of course, not many people were wise enough to invest in nuclear. The French have done that and did so thoughtfully from de Gaulle onwards. Not many others have done that. And I suspect we're going to see quite a lot of discussion about nuclear in the short term. And we need to recognize, I think, that in the short term, renewables are not going to be able to fill the gap that's there. So I think it's going to be a dodgy way ahead. And what we're seeing, of course, is Putin salivating at the prospect of using effectively one of the tools of total war without actually being at total war at the moment. So I'm pessimistic, I think, about what will happen from 23 onwards in relation to energy.
Right, thank you, Ambassador. Same question. And let me just alert, I have one more to ask. And the reason, I notice we have our mic over there. So if those of you who do want to ask questions, if you don't mind getting up and going over to the mic. So energy, how about, would you like to say something on that topic?
So,
and I have one last for both of you.
I'm going to be optimistic, which Nick will think is the typical view of all diplomats when confronted with problems. So I agree, this winter will be difficult, but it might not be the worst that needs to be faced. I'm more optimistic about the trajectory beyond because necessity is the mother of invention. I actually think for some countries, including the UK, the current crisis accelerates the energy transition. And I completely agree about nuclear. Nuclear is going to come back on to the agenda. The Germans have been rather leery of going back to nuclear, but other countries are looking at it very seriously. In the UK, excuse me, we look at small modular reactors, which is a different model from the French, but I think you can't, given the current crisis, get to the COP commitments unless you go back, or for some countries start with a nuclear section of your energy portfolio, as it were. And I think of the pandemic and the way people's habits and the machines and the tools like Zoom that people use. So I'm not quite as pessimistic as Nick. I do think Putin has based some of his calculations on the fact that he can bring Europe to its knees through energy. I think it is remarkable that so far he has not succeeded in dividing Europe nor the transatlantic alliance, much as some of what he's doing has been designed to do so. And I'm pretty sure that some of his saber rattling on using nuclear weapons is because he thinks the pacifist tendency in some European countries will start to put pressure on governments, and that hasn't worked either. So along with the measures we were discussing earlier about securing fuel supplies, I'm more optimistic. I'm also more optimistic because while it does take about 2 years to build an LNG gas terminal, by the time we get to the scenario Nick's describing, those gas terminals will have been built. And then we can ship gas over in much greater quantities. So I'm a bit more optimistic.
Right, great. I'm going to ask for a quick answer on this one because I see we got a queue already there and I want to go right to them. So a fast one, Ambassador, with you and then over to General Carter. Just should we be concerned about Ukraine fatigue? And, is there something we can do about it?
It's remarkable how much support for Ukraine has continued. I do think there is a different perception across the world if you look at the UN. I mean, for Europe, as Nick was saying, this is an absolutely vital security issue. Europe has started 2 world wars. Europe's largest country invaded its second largest country. and one of them has nukes. This is not something I would argue that the rest of the world ought to be ignoring and saying it's simply a bigger version of a conflict in Africa. It isn't. It symbolizes something much darker and much more capable of taking in more countries. So I do think there's complacency. Ukraine fatigue, I think it's only natural in political cycles that you get some people saying, well, that's too much money on Ukraine and we've got our own cost of living crisis and we need to shift resources. But I think fundamentally, the majority of people understand that this is a situation more akin to the start of the Second World War than anything we have seen since the end of the Second World War. Not to say it will go that way. Obviously, we will all be working to make sure it doesn't, and I personally don't think it will, but it does have that scale to it. And I think most people perceive that.
Thank you, General Carter. A brief word on this?
Yes, I mean, I agree with what Dame Karen said, although I would say that I think if you sit in the global south, that probably represents more than 40% of humanity, you may not see it quite as she has described it. I think you're either sitting on the fence or you're quite supportive of Putin's position. And actually, you probably believe that this is a way that the West has behaved in the past, if you didn't understand the rationale behind the invasion of Iraq. So I think it's not necessarily everybody would see it like that. I think in terms of the specifics of the question, I do think that a combination of complacency and perhaps being distracted by other things is a great risk. You know, we saw that with Afghanistan. There are still many Afghan families sitting in hotels waiting for accommodation in Europe and in particular in Britain at the moment, because of course the government understandably got distracted by Ukraine. So I think there is a risk of distraction. I also think there probably is a bit of a risk of fatigue. I mean, I know anecdotally a lot of my friends who've taken in Ukrainian families, and they were told it for 6 months, and they were told to be government support for 6 months. And of course, there no longer is the same level of government support and interest that perhaps they might have had in the past. And I guess that's probably the same in Europe. And certainly the many Ukrainians who went to Poland, and in particular to Warsaw, are finding life much harder than they did when they first went there. Now, the difference, of course, is that Ukrainians want to go back to Ukraine. It's a very different matter, I think, when we're dealing with Afghans and refugees who come from other countries. So I think, you know, in the longer term, that will be fine. But I do think we need to reflect more broadly on the narrative that we in the West, in the free world, are going to transmit to the global South if we want, in a sense, to answer your earlier question about how we achieve a Ukrainian or indeed victory in this war. The global South has got to be on our bench in a way that it's not at the moment.
Okay, thank you so much. Let's go to our first question, and if you'll introduce yourself, please.
Thank you so much. My name is Ilya Timchenko. I'm a second-year student at Harvard Kennedy School. I'm also head of the Ukraine caucus and also research assistant for Ambassador Paula Dobriansky. Do I have 2 questions?
Yes, but brief.
Okay, right.
Brief.
All right.
Brief, not a statement.
All right. So first question is, I think Great Britain was a great example in terms of training Ukrainian troops right now. There's an initiative for a few months to be training, I think it's up to 10,000 Ukrainian troops. So the question is, are there any specific initiatives of say, bringing those trainings to Central Eastern Europe and to quicken the process? Then my second question is a little bit more challenging in terms of Ambassador Pierce, you mentioned about corruption in Ukraine, and speaking with a lot of Ukrainians throughout the years, I mean, with civil society, they would be saying that, yes, corruption is a huge issue, but also we want to be seeing from the UK side in terms of dealing with, you know, the Londongrad, laundromat. There's different ways of saying that. So the question is there any specific initiative on a grand scale that would be dealing with Russian, you know, Kazakhstan, even Ukrainian oligarch money within Great Britain? Thank you.
So it sounds to me like the first one is for you and the second one is for Ambassador Pierce.
Yes, on the training, that's predominantly conducted in the UK. Ukrainian recruits are coming back to the UK and being trained in southern England at the moment. I think what that's showing is the huge amount of national enthusiasm and the strength of the moral component in Ukraine, because there's no shortage of people coming to do that. I think what's quite interesting about it is that the average age of those being trained at the moment is 34 years old. And I think that begs some questions, which, you know, I don't need to be clear about, but there are questions, I think, about the age of the people who are coming to be trained. I think that where the UK, of course, has been tried to be helpful is in terms of how we have helped Ukraine think about how it can achieve some of the offensive objectives it's achieved over the last 3 or 4 months. And certainly there's been an immense appetite to think laterally about how one does this. I think immense appetite to think about the operational art that might be applied to achieve the sort of effect they achieved back in early September and late August. And I think that's been encouraging. And I have to say that, having been closely associated with training Ukrainians on and off since the invasion of Crimea in 2014, one has been very impressed by the low-level professionalism and the skills that have come forward. I think, there's been a real desire to get away from perhaps their past and their heritage from, the way the Soviet Union trained people in order to get after some genuinely quite impressive skills.
Ambassador, if you'll take the second one.
So since the invasion, in fact, a little bit in the run up to it, there's been a rolling program of measures that have covered asset freezing, sanctions, taking the wealth of oligarchs, stopping them operating, visa bans. This has been replicated through the G7. There's a working group that looks at how to deal with the oligarchs, how to deny them special privileges, property measures have been changed, et cetera, et cetera. So the illicit finance side of this has its own work strand, and it is no longer possible or easy for Russian oligarchs and those who've been cited in the sanctions to operate out of London, use London banks, buy London property. And that's kept under review on a rolling basis, both through national legislation, British legislation, but also, as I say, through these multilateral measures in the G7.
All right. Thank you. And thank you, Ilya, for the question. And please come on up if you'll introduce yourself, please.
Hi, thank you so much for joining us today. Rafael Piliero, I'm a research assistant for Professor Graham Allison, where I work on his national security portfolio. So my question is about the nuclear threats that the Russian government has made, a number of implicit threats, including some that have actually been directed at the UK. As the Biden administration is, of course, wrestling with how to deter and, God forbid, respond to a potential tactical nuclear strike, I'm interested in the UK's perspective on the criterion for an effective deterrence or response strategy on the part of the US that, of course, has to balance not risking a catastrophic tit-for-tat escalation cycle, but of course, not allowing Putin to engage in aggression under a nuclear blackmail shield, or even normalizing nuclear use and eroding the taboo. So what might some options that might be successful, unsuccessful, be for the US to pursue in order to respond to this? Thank you.
Who would like to take that on first?
Well, I'm going to be really boring because it's a feature of deterrence that you don't spell out the circumstances in which you might retaliate, whether conventionally or with nuclear weapons. And I think we would probably keep that prohibition, to be honest. But it has been made clear both publicly and privately to the Kremlin that the use of even a tactical nuclear weapon will have very severe consequences. As a matter of deliberate policy, we don't spell that out because we don't want Putin to be able to calculate either that he could tolerate that or what his response would be. But I would say NATO is pretty united on that point. But Nick can talk more freely, she said, handing over it.
I think I would also start by just challenging the probability of this, because I think it's quite important that there's been a lot of rhetoric and quite a lot of sort of fearful stuff put out there. And my own view is that if Putin was sitting rationally thinking about the sort of cost versus gain of using a nuclear weapon, I think it would be the end of his relationship with China and India, for example, going back to my point about the importance of the global south. I also think he will struggle to find a target that would make the value of using a nuclear weapon genuinely to his benefit. And I also think that Russia has always been very clear about its nuclear doctrine and the clarity of the thresholds associated with it. So I would be surprised if this is not much more rhetoric than it is about the likelihood. I think the probability, in my sense, remains low. And in terms of what Dame Karen says about deterrence, I mean, I absolutely echo that. But I also think that Putin will be in no doubt about how NATO sees this, and also about the potential conventional responses that will be available. And of course, nowadays, we have the domains of space and cyber that are available to us in terms of retaliation if we need to. So I think the deterrence landscape is a much more complex landscape than it was back in the Cold War. And that, I think, gives uncertainty to that who might wish to undermine deterrence, but also to those who wish to apply deterrence. It's a much more complicated environment than it once was.
Can I leap back in just to say, if you look at the new American national security strategy, the line on deterrence and nuclear weapons is as formidable as it ever was. There was a lot of talk in the press that the president, building on something he'd said when he was vice president, might want to walk it back, but that didn't actually happen, which is a good signal. Second thing I'd say very quickly, you should always remember that one of Putin's aims in every single thing he does is to divide the West. And he knows that saber rattling on nuclear, as we said earlier, will get a certain resonance. So that's an additional aim for him, but it's always there.
By the way, if you don't mind, I'm just going to add a footnote, and the footnote is on Putin, that Putin actually, on the issue of their nuclear doctrine, actually has made some statements that are being very scrutinized right now, because they have been a little bit off from what the original is. And what does it mean? Not that anyone has come out with a different conclusion than what you stated. Thank you for your question very much. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you so much for coming. My name is Vidit Doshi. I'm a Master's in Public Policy student here. A question for Dame Karen. How can the UK say its #1 foreign policy objective is climate change when the Prime Minister is wavering on whether to attend COP27? And to you, Sir Nick, I'm glad you raised climate as an issue. I used to work on climate security in the government, and I found, frankly, a lack of interest amongst senior security policy folk on it. One, how important do you think it ranks, climate security? And then two, more importantly, what's the actual policy space within which we should be operating? Thank you.
Yes.
Well,
please.
very thankfully, the Prime Minister is going to COP27 in Egypt. So that's one answer to your question. I think your quote is from our integrated review, which is the equivalent of the National Security Strategy. And I myself was surprised when I saw that, but then I went and read it, and it explains that the long-term #1 priority is climate change, and everything the new Prime Minister has said supports that. And you should remember, I think, that when he was Chancellor, he actually introduced a rather good programme of building efficiency, which sounds very dull and boring, but actually, if you want to tackle climate change, and just as importantly, if you want to persuade people typically on the right that climate change is worth tackling, coming to it from the perspective of energy efficiency in buildings, which obviously brings benefits for business, has proved to be a good way of doing it. So I can assure you it's our longest term #1 priority.
I would commend a publication that the UK Ministry of Defence produces called Global Strategic Trends, which would be worth your reading, because what that explains, and in a sense sets the context for, is an approach to climate change, which we believe is important. What I would observe, we often say that, economic disasters lead to security challenges. The same will happen with climate. And we see that already in relation to Africa in particular. If you look at the imagery of what Lake Chad looked like 30 years ago to what it looks like now, one can understand why migration is a feature of our security challenge. And of course, we all know that that is getting greater rather than less. So if we can't fix climate, it is going to be very challenging for the continent, which is going to have more human beings in it than any other continent at all by 2050, for those human beings to live and have their being there. So I think that there are real security challenges that will flow from this, which mean it's all of our problem, but it's a defense problem as well as everybody else's problem.
But what do you think we should do about it? I mean, the migration will happen. We know that.
Yeah.
What should we do about it?
Well, I think it does mean that we do need to have a focus on Africa. We do need to have a focus on why people are migrating. And that does mean that what is perhaps manifesting itself in the Sahel and parts of sort of Islamic Africa more broadly are problems for all of us. And that does mean, I think, that we can't afford to sit back in Europe and allow this just to happen. It does mean we're going to have to get involved.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Please. And if you'll introduce yourself, please.
Hi, my name's Catherine Katz. I am a student at the law school, and in my other life, I'm also a historian. And Ambassador Pierce, you and I met virtually a long time ago. You would have no memory of this during an event with Ivo Dalder and the Chicago Council on
right.
Global Affairs. So as a historian, in working on a book about the Yalta Conference, I've thought a lot about how countries do a really good job of articulating the objectives of entering a war, but not necessarily having a clear vision of what we want about how to successfully end a war. And in the case of ending a war in Ukraine, potentially, hopefully pushing the Russians out completely, that would likely mean some sort of activity that it doesn't necessarily stop right at the border, but would probably cross into Russia itself. And thinking about history, when troops march into Russia, that's a whole different ballgame from the Napoleonic Wars to World War II. So is there a way to think about how to end the war successfully with that looming potential for awakening the beast of the Russian motherland? And is there a way to break that pattern historically, potentially by drawing in new allies such as the Kazakhs or others in Central Asia who might be less willing to go along with Putin and be open to new alliance relationships with the West?
I think you're absolutely right about the perils of invading the Russian motherland, and the political hazard of doing that is enormous, which is why NATO countries and NATO as an organization has tried to make it very clear that we are not about regime change in Moscow, but we do want the Russians out of Ukraine. And it goes back to the earlier question about what needs to be thought about in order to achieve that objective. I think fundamentally it's about restoring Ukraine's sovereignty and ability to control its own destiny. And that in turn does put the focus on Ukraine to say when Ukraine wants to negotiate. But I don't think anyone at the moment is envisaging having to take the fight to Russian territory itself for all the reasons you say. I do think that, as with the Syria and Libya conflicts, you get new kids on the block, as it were, in international affairs who suddenly become players, or a resurgence of old players. I'm thinking of Turkey. Turkey has a huge influence in the Ukraine crisis, not least because she helped the UN negotiate the grain deliveries. I think some of the Central Asians, particularly Kazakhstan, could play that role. There's still something very strange about that Russian intervention in Kazakhstan that preceded the intervention in Ukraine. And there are a couple of other countries in that category. MBZ, the president of UAE, was in Moscow recently. And a number of countries will look at this through an economic as well as a political lens. I would say at the moment it's just a bit too soon to draw conclusions. But I think the growing readiness of Turkey to take a stance on the world stage, not necessarily a principled stance, but nevertheless to be a player in the thick of all these issues is really interesting, and one we need to engage more with.
General Carter, do you want to make a comment, or shall we move on?
No, happy to move on.
Move on. All right. Thank you for the question. Please.
Hi, good morning. My name is Hannah. I'm a second-year master's student, and prior to joining Harvard, I was in the policy team for Dame Angela McLean, Chief Scientific Advisor at the MOD. If I may, I'd like to bring in the topic of China into this conversation, namely whether Putin's invasion of Ukraine has changed how NATO, the US specifically, or the European community needs to think about its presence and participation in security concerns in the Indo-Pacific, and whether there are any inherent trade-offs in participating in that arena versus maintaining stability in the European sphere, or if there's actually more of an opportunity to reconcile the two.
General Carter, please take that.
Yeah, I think it's worth reflecting on what China might have deduced from what has happened over the last 6 or 7 months, and whether that makes perhaps reunification in relation to Taiwan more or less likely. and indeed whether it makes, if you like, an invasion of Taiwan more or less likely. And my own view, perhaps being optimistic, is that I think it probably makes it less likely in the short term, because I think that China will have drawn some conclusions about the difficulty of absorbing a country in the way that Mr. Putin has set about doing it. And of course, we all imagined that Russia was perhaps rather more capable than it has proven to be, but I suspect in many ways it is still more capable than China is in terms of its ability to conduct combat operations, given that there's probably only one man in the Chinese military who's had combat operations, and that was General Dunford's in my opposite number, who'd fought in Vietnam in 1979. So I suspect that from a purely military perspective, this might have made China a little bit more cautious about perhaps some of its rhetoric and the way that it might go about absorbing Taiwan. That doesn't mean it won't try it in other ways, using hybrid techniques to achieve that, as we saw post the Pelosi visit. But I think an invasion becomes less likely in relation to this. But also, I suspect also from an economic perspective, because of course what we're seeing is that China has observed on the way in which we've frozen Russian assets in our economies. And I suspect that we're seeing China rushing to the exit in terms of how it perhaps tries to disperse some of its funds to places that we can't control in the way that it did before. And what does it mean in terms of our thinking about the Indo-Pacific? I rather hope it'll focus our minds. And I rather hope it will focus not just American minds, but also European minds, because our dependence on the Chinese economy is no different to the rest of the world. And from that perspective, I think we need to be reflecting hard on what our approach to China is going to be, and whether that approach is going to be one that is purely seen through a prism of competition, but perhaps, as I would prefer, one that is about collaboration as well as competition.
Ambassador Pierce, would you like to add on that? Can we move on?
Happy to move on.
Okay, all right. Thank you for the question. And please, next, would introduce yourself. Yes.
Hi, I'm Christina Last, postgraduate master's student at MIT and Fulbright Fellow. I wanted to ask two questions. One on how the US and the UK are collaborating on cyber resilience and cyber defense. And second, to what extent is the US willing to support the UK in its dispute with the EU over the Irish border?
All right. General Carter, would you mind taking the cyber? Let's take the cyber one. Okay. And I will join you on the second one. Okay. Okay, please.
So on the cyber question, one won't go into too much detail on this, but the plain fact is that we've always had a very close relationship with the United States across the piece, but particularly on intelligence and on cyber. General Nakasone is a good mate of mine, and he's a good mate of the person who took over from me. And the connection between what our GCHQ and our Ministry of Defense does and what he gets up to is close. It's a great working relationship.
Kicked off by Ash Carter and Michael Fallon.
Yes.
Which is nice. Right.
On the second one, because you did say about the US, I'll just say this briefly, because having been the president's envoy to Northern Ireland in the George W. Bush administration and still very engaged in it. One, I'm going to say that first, we've appreciated greatly the group that's very interested in these issues. And there is a group in Washington, not just the governmental group, but those out of government. First, I'd start with saying that the embassy has consistently, in fact, Ambassador Pierce's predecessor, and no less Ambassador Pierce, she and her team have constantly opened the door for engagement and for hearing our views on this issue. There is interest. There is a real desire to have a resolution here. There has been also, I think, unanimity of purpose that one must preserve the spirit of and the Good Friday Agreement. And here there are some challenges. One looks at what the EU has put forward, and then also what are the practicalities on the ground. Quite frankly, there's a lot of trade that just flows between Northern Ireland and Ireland. And so how do you find the way forward? My simple answer to you is there is, yes, a keen interest from the public and the private side. Secondly, I have found the UK government really quite open and engaged in this and trying to find a solution. And thirdly, and maybe most significantly, also in a way that preserves the Good Friday Agreement. Okay. Next, please.
Cheesecake,
No,
stop freezing that.
well, no, I,
Letter off the
no,
hook.
Very much.
no, absolutely. No, I noticed on time, because we always like to run on time, we have 15 minutes and we want to get all three questions. So please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Kei Kitanohara. I'm from Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, and I'm from Japan. So I'm interested in the diversity of the energy resources. So you mentioned that we have to change the dependence on the Russia to other countries. So I think there are inevitable to a conflict between other countries to assure the diversity of the energy. So what the role UK could play in the global stages? Does it make sense?
Right, I'm going to take that. Before we did touch upon the energy piece. I think I'll expand your question. I think, we looked at what the UK is doing, what Britain's doing internally, and then the European sphere, but take it a little bit more broadly, which I think is your question. Are there certain connections here? I certainly Japan in energy, taking not just the question of nuclear, but I look at hydrogen. You have really focused on the whole question of hydrogen. Are there ways of diversification here, and there's broader engagement? Go beyond just the European continent. Either of you, do you have a comment on this? General,
the
go
answer
ahead.
is, I think that when you look at it globally, certainly from a gas perspective, there's going to be a huge amount of competition. In a way, we're quite lucky at the moment that China's economy is not moving as fast as it once did, because Chinese demand for gas is a lot suppressed this year and probably maybe into the middle of next year, given their zero COVID policy and everything associated with that. I think if it's worth focusing on the Gulf, and I think it's worth focusing on in which there are going to be some significant beneficiaries in the Gulf in terms of the rising cost of energy. And if you look at Qatar, for example, they are doing very well off this, and so much so that they're about to open a massive new field called the North Field. And they're already beginning to negotiate some pretty hard bargains with countries globally, not least in Europe, but also in your direction as well. So I think what we're going to see is a significant competition. That's going to push the cost of it up. And when you think that the price of natural gas has gone up tenfold in the last 18 months, so regardless of the ambassador's optimism about all of this, it's going to be very expensive. And we're going to need to come to terms with the fact that we're going to be spending more of our money on energy than we are on anything else. So I think it's going to be very competitive, and I think it's going to require countries to think quite laterally about how they do diversify and how they play into this global competition, which is only going to get more competitive than less competitive.
I'd add to that, I think it's a subset also of how do you secure supplies more generally. How are we going to do friend shoring? It's not quite a shoring issue, but how do we make sure we have enough resilience? Who are our friends and allies when it comes to ensuring supplies of anything that's critical? That work goes on, but it's sluggish. It's very slow to get off the ground, but it's fundamentally a group of countries that you might think of as G7 plus, sometimes called the D10 or the D12. It doesn't work to do it through G20 because you have Russia and China in the G20. So that's not a helpful grouping. I do think the UK has been helping already by releasing strategic reserves, as has America. LNG is shipped from Baltimore to the UK and we pipe it to Europe. Now there's a natural limit on that, but nevertheless, we'll exploit that to the full. Renewables and hydrogen, research in and rolling out of, I think that is something where the UK has a particular scientific edge. And I think we bizarrely have the largest wind farm in the world in the UK. Says something about UK's weather. But there are things there that I think innovation-wise, we also do a huge amount on helping farmers adapt, which goes back to a question we had earlier about climate. Adaptation sounds like a weasel answer, but actually helping farmers adapt to different conditions with different crops we put a lot of work into agricultural research. So I think a mix of all those things is our global offer, if you like.
I'm going to thank you very much for the question. I'm going to suggest we take both of your questions, the two of you, if you don't mind. And we also have one cue in the chat from a former colleague, Ambassador Marcy Rees, who was ambassador to Bulgaria. We're going to take hers, but let's take you two, and then we'll get an answer, and then we'll get Ambassador Rees's. Please.
Hello, my name is Björn Heume. I'm an active duty German Army officer, and at the moment a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School. My question is about NATO, and it's a middle and long-term perspective. You underlined the importance of a strong American presence in Europe and a strong American position inside NATO, and I'm in absolutely agreement with that. However, in the middle and longer future, we might see a shift of American prioritization because of the rising challenge in Asia, let's say because of China. And so my question is, how can we step up our game in Europe and strengthen the European pillar? Usually I would have said this is an easy answer. We use the EU as a pillar, but I think that's not an option which the UK would prefer because you're not longer a member of the club. So what's your suggestion? How can we maintain NATO's strength, stepping up the European game, but accompany to the future when America won't be so engaged as at the moment?
All right, thank you. And if you don't mind, thank you stepping aside. And
thank you so
please.
much. My name is Nelly. I'm a second-year student here at the Harvard Kennedy School. And my question relates to your point about the general balance of power. You've mentioned Putin's will to divide the Western democracies. You've mentioned a certain level of support from the South. And so my questions relates to the appropriate answers that you foresee at the strategic and political level in terms of rebalancing the powers and making sure that Western democracies still have a say and keep a certain level of attractivity worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you both. General Carter, would you mind? Let's begin with you. We'll come to Ambassador Pierce, and then we'll get Ambassador Marcy Rees's question after that. That'll be our last question of this session.
I mean, I think your two questions actually are very closely linked in many ways, because I think that what they beg is a debate about what our Western or free world approach should be to what is now an era of constant competition with authoritarian powers testing the very multilateral system that we've all become used to over the last 70 years. And I think that the answer to that question is the one that has to come first. And from that will flow, I think, the approach that will be necessary, both in Europe, but more broadly in the free world. And I don't have an answer to it. But what I am absolutely clear about is there is a vacuum in terms of the multilateral system at the moment. You know, we haven't obeyed the rules always. There's a lot of people who are now trying to find ways around those rules. Now, rules may not be the right way to think about it, but there has to be a multilateral system that assures our security, stability, and prosperity. And that is, I think, the big question for the coming generation to get its mind around, because what we've got at the moment is quite clearly not fit for purpose.
Okay, Ambassador.
Yes, I think that over time, the nature of the US presence in Europe will shift a bit, but only a bit. It's been the way it is for 70 odd years, and at each decade, someone predicts that this will be the decade America leaves Europe. I don't think that's right. And only the only the British and US nuclear deterrents are badged to NATO. The French one is independent. So there's an issue there as to what's the nuclear umbrella for the transatlantic space. And I think Ukraine and Russia's actions are a great wake-up call as to why we're not going to take any risks in that area. I think there's more the EU can do. We were very pleased to join President Macron's political security initiative recently. But I think without Britain and without Turkey, there's a natural limit on the security power, defense power of the European Union without those two countries on the periphery. So I think NATO is going to be essential for a very long time yet. And as General Nick was explaining, these new challenges means it can answer President Macron's charge of being brain dead. Completely agree with General Nick on what he said about democracies. I think one problem is that democracies are very messy. And as we opened with today, some democracies have had messier periods than normal. And the problem is, if you're Russia and China, that's fine. You just use that for your own purposes. If you're an emerging economy and you're looking for role models, sometimes the non-democratic way is simply easier as a matter of public policy. So I agree with General Nick. We on our side need to do much more to explain that open societies bring real benefits for citizens, ordinary citizens. They lead to better science, they lead to better economic outcomes, they lead to better human rights, etc. And if anyone hasn't read it, I would encourage you to read the original Atlantic Charter between FDR and Churchill, followed by a very little known science charter. And the point of that is that they do explain rather well, and it's a pity we can't use that language now, we're just not as good as they were at drafting. They do explain why open societies, transparency, information sharing, objectivity, contrast with Nazism, bring direct benefits to citizens. And we kind of need that sort of campaign now, I think.
All right, let's get our, thank you both. Let's get our final question, which is from Ambassador Marcy Rees, and Erica will read it out to us.
So you addressed this a little bit in your comments just now, but Ambassador Rees asks, what would you say to Americans who feel that the US is spending too much on Ukraine when there are such great needs at home? Why should they be worried about what Russia is doing in Ukraine? Why shouldn't this be a European problem to solve?
Okay, and if you don't mind answering that question, we could work this way. Ambassador will go to you first, and then General Carter. And if there's anything else you'd like to just even conclude with, because this is our last round. So, Ambassador.
Well, nice to see Ambassador Rees again virtually, and she and I work closely on the Balkans. I think the answer is not straightforward, but it's one we meet all the time when we're asked about aid to developing countries fundamentally. If we do not stop something really evil now, it will eventually get to us. And it will be cheaper, I'm sorry to say. It is cheaper to stop it now. And I remember Alison Bales, who Marcy will probably know. She's a great security expert, and she used to say America sits on top of a mountain. If you sit on top of a mountain, you obviously see a long way into the distance, and you see the threats coming towards you, and you deal with them before they actually get to your homeland. And that's the American way. Europe tends to sit more in the valleys. You deal with the threats when they're right on your doorstep. And I think there's something in that. But I think fundamentally, for the American people, the world has developed peacefully on the whole since 1945 because of that implicit and generous American guarantee on the whole, it's always on the whole, of prosperity and security, and that America stands behind that. And when people start to believe that isn't the case, it won't just be Ukraine. There'll be many more bad things happening, and they will affect America, even if only the American economy.
Thank you, General.
And I very strongly support what Dame Karen's just said. If we don't stop it now, then he will just look for more. And through stopping it now, we're also sending messages to others, whether they're Iranians, North Koreans, or Chinese for that matter. And I also very strongly agree with America's position in this, because I have a son who's just settled in Dallas, and it's a bit of a pilgrimage of me to go and see where President Kennedy was assassinated. And I would commend to you a visit to that, because it's a remarkable historical area. But there's a plaque there, which is, and on it, it has a quote or an excerpt from the speech that he would have given if he'd been able to get to the Dallas Trade Mart to give that speech. And I'll just read you the first sentence from it. We in this country, in this generation, are by destiny rather than choice, the watchmen on the walls of world freedom. And I fundamentally believe that's the role that America has in the world. And I really strongly believe that we should be supporting America in having that role in the world. And I very much hope that we return to a position where we all see it like that.
Ambassador Dame Karen Pierce and General Sir Nick Carter, what a tour de force this morning. We're living in a very challenged geopolitical environment. And I think we really have benefited from hearing your very cogent, concise, very thoughtful, to say the least, perspective from the UK, European security and beyond. And so please join me in thanking them for coming this morning.